Mr. Mandela, I thank you for giving us some of your time. What's the object of your visit to Algeria?
Well, for us as Nelson Mandela's family, first and foremost, South Africa, the African National Congress, and our government has declared 2018 to be the centennial year of our founding father and our global icon, President Nelson Mandela. If Madiba would have lived, he would be 100 years this year. Now we are commemorating and reliving his legacy. One of those legacies is that in the early 60s, my grandfather left South Africa illegally to come into Africa to mobilize support for our struggle for liberation, but also was to come and receive his military training, which he received here in Algeria. So for us, this is a historic journey to walking in Madiba's footsteps. But this happens also at a critical time of our history, where we are attending the conference of the Sahrawi people's struggle for self-determination. As you would know, that South Africa and Western Sahara, but most importantly, the liberation movements, the African National Congress, as well as Polisario, have always shared a common struggle embedded in pain, suffering, and being exposed at the hands of oppressive regimes. And that common struggle has always enabled us to relate to one another as not only as friends, but brothers and sisters and comrades in arms for the plight to seek our liberation.
Is this your first visit to our country?
This is my first visit to the Maghreb region, as well as my first visit to Algeria, whom my grandfather regarded his second home. Yeah. So that being my grandfather's second home translates to, it is the second home of the Mandelas. So I might be miles away from South Africa, but the reception here has made me feel like I'm at home.
You went to Tindouf. How did you find the situation there?
Well, we arrived here in Algiers and we were able to visit our ambassador of South Africa stationed here in Algiers. And then we went to meet with the ambassador of Sahrawi Republic. And at both occasions, we were with my grandfather's friend, brother and comrade in arms, comrade Nordine Judy, which he rendered many memories of the time he spent with my grandfather as his translator. We then flew out to Tindouf to visit the refugee camps. For us, it was a real awakening. You know, we sit in South Africa and not so much understand in full expression as to what the Sahrawi people are experiencing, particularly in occupied Western Sahara. So it was very heartbreaking to be there and seeing an entire people living in the desert without a proper infrastructure in place, and also living on only 25% of what is their land. 75% of Western Sahara is still occupied by an apartheid oppressive regime of Morocco. So visiting the camps, meeting young people and women in the camps who told first-hand experiences about their challenges and their struggle. But I think the humanitarian activists that we met who spoke highly about political prisoners and civilians that have disappeared. You have over 4,500 prisoners that have just totally disappeared and unaccounted for, which was a shocking experience for us to hear that. But also visiting the museum, the Liberation Museum, to see the tanks that were captured by Polisario, destined for Morocco from the apartheid regime, cemented what we always had known, that the real supporters of the apartheid regime in South Africa were Morocco, were Israel. And finding those kinds of weapons coming from our homeland, fighting against our own brothers and sisters, was really heartbreaking. But also to see the 2,700-kilometer wall that has been constructed along the entire occupied Western Sahara reminded us of the walls that are being constructed by the apartheid Israel in Palestine. But also it instilled hope in us because we witnessed the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And indeed, we have said to the Sahrawi people that like the Berlin Wall collapsed, we believe that this wall as well will collapse. But it was shocking that in that 2,700-kilometer stretch of a wall, there are over 7,000 landmines that are planted there, which tells you the kind of regime that we are dealing with, that of the Moroccan regime. So it was really a heartbreaking experience for us to be in the refugee camps and to be able to hear these stories firsthand. I advised the young activists that they should, like we did as South Africans, once our leaders were sentenced to life on Robben Island, once the political parties were all banned and we were silenced, those that managed to go into exile became active ambassadors for our struggle for liberation. They became the voice of a voiceless majority in South Africa. And they crisscrossed the continent and the entire global community, telling our story. That was our message to these young activists, that they must never rest. It cannot be of us that we must travel all the way from South Africa to the refugee camps to gain a thorough understanding of what is happening in Western Sahara. They need to ensure that they go out into the global community and tell of their story, tell of the atrocities that are being meted out on a daily basis against the Sahrawi people in occupied Western Sahara. They need to ensure that they speak as one voice against a common enemy, and really support throughout the continent as well as in the global community. We need to exert a lot of pressure to liberate the last colony in Africa. Africa will never be entirely free as long as Western Sahara is still occupied and colonized by Morocco. And we call for the liberation and the right to self-determination of Western Sahara.
Your grandfather, Nelson Mandela, has stayed in Algeria during the Liberation War. Did he talk to you about this period of his life?
Yes, my grandfather has always had fond memories about coming to Algeria. I think for him personally, Algeria was a turning point in his own life and his own commitment to the struggle for liberation. He came to Algeria to be trained as a commander-in-chief of Mkhonto Wesizwe. And for him, he was certain that we can no longer be bystanders against an oppressive regime and a brutal regime of apartheid that was silencing our people and killing our people. And we needed to ensure that we alter the manner we engaged with this oppressive regime. And through his military training, he tabled a motion in the NEC of the African National Congress, the National Executive Committee, where he moved for a motion of adopting a military campaign through an armed struggle. And many of leaders of his era would tell you that he had an immense challenge from Moses Kotane, because Moses Kotane didn't believe that we could be possible to run an effective campaign against one of the best military regimes in the continent. But it was the collective leadership with leaders like Walter Sisulu that were able to guide my grandfather that you need to explain what you mean to Moses Kotane. And it was only when my grandfather was actually to take Moses Kotane on board to tell him that we are actually looking to adopt acts of sabotage to cripple the functionability of this government. We want to destroy the power stations so that the white minority can also feel and understand the challenges that black and the majority of South Africans are witnessing on a daily exercise. But I think of most important, what my grandfather came to learn out of the Algerian trip was the connection with other liberation movements throughout the continent. He always used to say that Algeria was a home for revolutionaries. You may regard Rome to be the home of Christians, Mecca to be the holy city for Muslims, but Algeria is a home for every revolutionary. It was here in Algeria that South Africans, and particularly our leaders in the liberation movements, that were inspired by the gallant decision of His Excellency President Bouteflika when he expelled the apartheid regime from the United Nations. It was here that my grandfather would be inspired to realize that there were brothers and sisters in the continent that shared the same struggle as we did, that shared the same pain and suffering as we did. And it was here on these grounds that Madiba was able to build a relationship with leaders like Augustino Neto, with leaders like Tovia Natovia, also doing connections with leaders like Sheikh Overia, to be able to link our plight for the struggle for liberation with the Cuban support. So here was a country that gave itself, sacrificed itself in order to liberate the entire continent. And we as beneficiaries of Algeria's commitment have a lot that we owe to Algeria for our freedom. And we will always be indebted to you for the contribution that you made.
What's left of Nelson Mandela's memory and fight 5 years after his death?
I think my grandfather best concludes his legacy and memory in his book, Long Walk to Freedom. He writes in the last chapter that he's sitting on top of a hill and enjoying the vista that surrounds him. When he looks back, he realizes the many rivers he's had to cross and the many hills he's had to overcome. But as he sits on top of the hill, enjoying the vista that surrounds him, he realizes that awaiting in the journey ahead are so many rivers and so many hills to be overcome. Today, Madiba may no longer be with us, but the onus is on this current generation to pick up that baton, to cross those rivers and overcome those hills that lie ahead. Today's generation has the responsibility of carrying on the work that was initiated by Comrade President Bouteflika, as well as many liberation movement leaders in the continent that my grandfather came to know, that Oliver Tambo came to be comrades and brothers in arms with. But there's a lot that lies ahead for us. As long as Africa continues to have the last colony being Western Sahara, means that we as a continent owe it to ourselves to realize a totally decolonized Africa. We need to strive for the liberation of Western Sahara. We need to ensure that Western Sahara is liberated in our time. And we call on all African countries to unite behind Polisario as well as the Sahrawi people to ensure that we call on Morocco to withdraw from occupied Western Sahara and ensure that Africa is able to liberate itself in totality. But it is in order for us to prosper as the next generation, to ensure that we are an embodiment of what Madiba represented. A lot of people have a tendency of looking at Madiba's commitment to the struggle for liberation as a struggle that was to liberate the oppressed. He summed it up perfectly in his Rivonia trial, when he said, I have fought against black domination and I have fought against white domination. To truly understand that, you would understand that Madiba's commitment to the struggle for liberation was not only to liberate the oppressed, but was to liberate the oppressor himself. The African National Congress, when it collapsed the apartheid regime, it not only just collapsed it, but it swallowed it within. A lot of the apartheid regime leaders found homage within the ANC government that rised in 1994. And we commend the collective leadership that worked side by side with Madiba for us to realize this freedom that we have today. But we owe it to our brothers and sisters in Algeria for having stood side by side with us during our darkest days.
Mr. Mandela, about the ANC, the reputation of this ANC created by your grandfather has been tarnished by corruption cases. How do you perceive the drift of this symbol of Nelson Mandela's long fight?
There's a tendency to always be mistaken about looking at a 106-year-old liberation movement, to see it through the eyes of an individual. That's the biggest mistake that many analysts make. From inception, the African National Congress has had a collective leadership that has been faced with many challenges. And as a collective, they've been able from generation to generation to address those challenges that lay in front of it. And I believe that even in post the era of our founding father and global icon, President Nelson Mandela, the collective leadership of Thabo Mbeki, of Jacob Zuma, and even the current president, His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa, have a responsibility of rooting out these evils that we are witnessing. And the ANC itself has placed corruption as one of its key priority issues. And we need to stop just speculating about issues, but finding the root of these issues. The former president, if I may speak about His Excellency President Zuma, was charged with 783 cases. And we still say that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. And it says everyone in the Republic is innocent until proven guilty. And we say that any person must be given the opportunity to be scrutinized through the courts of law. And we should be able to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And this is why it's therefore crucial for this ANC-led government to move beyond just allegations and rumors and find the real cases that it can be able to win and convict. It is only then that we will begin addressing corruption, when we look at the real issues embedded there.
Your grandfather was a fervent defender of the Sahrawi cause. Is the support of South Africa to the Western Sahara people still strong?
Our visit by His Excellency President Zuma to Morocco on a fact-finding mission as to what the position of Morocco is today might have cast doubts about South Africa's position. But we want to state it clearly that the ANC's 54th National Conference passed an unwavering support for the struggle of the Sahrawi people. And we want to say that our struggle is not just born yesterday, but it's a historic relation that is intertwined in a common struggle of pain and suffering from oppressive regimes. We both liberation movements from the African National Congress and Polisario were able to work jointly on a common cause in the past. We continue, even in our liberated South Africa, to pledge that support to Western Sahara and its occupied territories, that we will not rest until they too realize their freedom. My grandfather is known to have stood in Gaza and uttered the following words to the Palestinians, that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. And we dare say today that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Sahrawi people. And we will ensure that we liberate Africa by ensuring that we decolonize the last colony of Africa.
Is the outcome of the Sahrawi cause near, according to you?
There are realities that we need to be able to look into in the recent past months. I think first and foremost, the biggest issue that needs to be looked into is Resolution 1415 of the United Nations of implementing a referendum in Western Sahara. That referendum will be a clear indicator to the rest of the world as to what the Sahrawi people seek in their common purpose of a struggle for self-determination. But also of importance to us has been the decision of the European Court of Justice, which was able to regard Western Sahara and Morocco as separate sovereign states, therefore protecting the rights, the sovereign rights of Western Sahara's land and international waters. So that was a major step in favor of Western Sahara. But also our High Court in South Africa has been able to rule in favor of the captured phosphate gas tanks that were confiscated, to say that this is illegal extraction of resources out of Western Sahara. So therefore, again, emphasizing the sovereignty of Western Sahara. We within the African continent, in our regions, need to rally behind Western Sahara, ensure that in the Pan-African Parliament, as well as in the African Union, we are drawn by a common purpose of ensuring that Western Sahara receives its freedom in our lifetime. But more so, we need to become leaders in this cause. It cannot be a campaign that is led by the European Union nor the Western countries. It is an African problem that is located within the African continent, and its solution is within Africa itself. And this is why we call on the African countries to do justice and right by Western Sahara.
You tell us about Algeria that it was a cradle of liberation movement. So, but French and Moroccan media and even hostile NGOs are attacking Algeria on its humanitarian policy. Do you have an answer to give them?
It will always be the case, isn't it? When the entire liberation movements understand the true cause of what Algeria is, there will be those that drive the negative message to try and destroy the impact Algeria has had on humanity throughout of the African continent. Even during our time in the darkest days of apartheid, the African National Congress and many other liberation movements in South Africa were cast as terrorists. and were spoken to be the ones that are carrying the evils in South Africa. But we were not deterred by those messages. We continued on our fight to liberate South Africa. We continued to put our ambassadors who became the voices for a voiceless nation living under an oppressive regime. And we want to say to the Algerians, do not tire. Continue doing what you know is right. Because the ticks that we take, such as the tick we take for South Africa's liberation, it is truly owed to Algerian efforts. And every other liberation movement that attains its freedom on the African continent will attest that that freedom came at the hands and the assistance and the help of the Algerian people. You look at Algerians' tireless efforts in the struggle for self-determination of Western Sahara. They gave 1.5 million soldiers, Algerians, that died for a cause of a liberated Western Sahara. And they have not stopped. They continue supporting that cause. So regardless what Morocco may say, regardless what interested parties like France may say, we know what the true contribution of Algeria is. And it cannot be erased by distortions and lies.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mandela.
Thank you. Thank you.